The box was sitting on the kitchen table when I got home from school, unremarkable in every way, brown cardboard, medium-sized, taped shut with the slightly excessive thoroughness my mother applied to everything she wanted to feel permanent. My name was written on the top in her handwriting. I'm Dana. I was 42 years old, a high school history teacher, and I had driven 40 minutes from Kellerton to my mother's house in Denton every other Sunday for the past 19 years. I knew her kitchen the way you know a place you've moved through without ever fully examining: the creak of the third floorboard, the smell of instant coffee and lavender dish soap, the particular quality of afternoon light through the yellowed curtains she refused to replace. Sylvia was standing at the counter with her back to me when I walked in. She said the box was things she'd been clearing out. She said she was doing a late life sort, getting organized, didn't want to leave a mess for people to deal with. She said it with the matter-of-fact briskness she used for everything, as if the contents of the box were as neutral as old dish towels. I took it home without opening it in front of her. Something in her posture, shoulders held slightly too still, hands moving slightly too deliberately over the counter, made me want distance between me and whatever was inside before I looked. I teach history. I spend my professional life explaining to 16-year-olds that the past is never as settled as it appears, that what gets recorded, what gets omitted, what gets handed down as fact is always someone's choice. I tell them to ask who benefits from a particular version of events. I tell them that the most dangerous histories are the ones that feel completely natural, the ones no one thinks to question because they've always been there. I have been teaching this for 17 years. It took me until 42 to apply it to my own family. The box contained, among other things, a bundle of letters held together with a rubber band so old it had fused to the paper. The envelopes were addressed to my mother. The return address, repeated across 11 envelopes spanning a period of 4 years, was a name I recognized and an address I didn't. The name was Robert Vane. My father. The man who, according to every version of my life I had ever been given, had walked out when I was 2 years old and never looked back. 11 letters. The earliest postmarked when I was 3. The most recent when I was 7. I stood in my own kitchen at 42 years old, my coat still on, my bag still over my shoulder, and I read the first one. By the time I finished the third, I understood that the story I had been living inside for 4 decades was not the story that had actually happened. I should tell you what I knew, or believed I knew, before that box. My father left when I was 2. That was the bedrock fact, the sentence that preceded everything else in the story of my origins, stated so early and so consistently that it had ceased to be information and become simply weather, the permanent condition of the landscape I'd grown up in. Sylvia never spoke about him with anger, which I'd always found slightly unusual and had interpreted as dignity. She said he was unreliable. She said some people weren't built for family life. She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it feel more definitively true. There were no photographs. She'd explained this once. When I was about 9, she'd put them away because having them out was confusing for me, and then eventually it seemed easier not to bring them back. I had accepted this. Children accept the architecture of their childhood as given. You don't question the walls because the walls are just the room you live in. I grew up in Kellerton knowing I was fatherless in the way some children are, not dramatically, not as a wound I performed, but as a quiet permanent absence that shaped the floor plan of who I became. I was self-sufficient early. I was good at not needing things I couldn't have. I chose a husband, Paul, who was steady and present in the specific way of someone who understood that consistency was a form of love. I had a son, Eli, and I watched Paul be his father with a gratitude that had an extra layer to it I couldn't always name. The first thing I should have questioned, and didn't, for decades, was my Aunt Miriam. Miriam was Sylvia's younger sister, and she had always been slightly uncomfortable around me in a way I'd categorized as her general social awkwardness. She asked about my life with a careful attentiveness that, in retrospect, carried a quality of monitoring rather than simple interest. When I spoke about my father, in the rare moments it came up, she would go very still. Not sad still. Careful still. The stillness of someone managing what they know. I noticed it. I filed it under, Miriam is an anxious person. And I moved on. The second thing was a conversation I'd had with Sylvia when I was 26, newly married, newly thinking about children. I'd asked her, with the directness of someone who has just made a major life commitment and is taking stock, whether she knew where my father was. Whether he was alive. She said she didn't know. She said they'd lost touch completely. She said it the way she said everything, evenly, without excess emotion, in a tone that closed the subject like a lid closing on a box. I believed her. Not because the answer was particularly satisfying, but because Sylvia had always seemed like a person incapable of sustained deception. She was too organized for it, too precise. Liars, I had decided at some point, were chaotic people, inconsistent, slippery. My mother was the opposite of slippery. I was wrong about that in the most fundamental way possible. What I'd mistaken for the incapacity to deceive was actually extraordinary discipline. Sylvia hadn't maintained a lie for 40 years by being careless. She'd maintained it by being exactly who she appeared to be in every other dimension of her life, reliable, consistent, present. The deception didn't coexist with her character. It was load-bearing inside it. Looking back now, I understand that the conversation at 26 was a turning point I walked away from. She'd given me the answer that closed the door, and I had accepted it because opening the door further would have required me to distrust my mother in a way I wasn't prepared for. I wanted her version of the story to be true. Not because it was a good story, a father who vanished without looking back is not a good story, but because it was the story that kept everything stable. Questioning it meant questioning everything built on top of it. I chose stability. For 16 more years, I chose it. I read all 11 letters the night I found them. Paul was downstairs with Eli, some television program, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening, and I sat on the edge of our bed with the letters arranged chronologically in front of me and I read them in order, twice. They were not the letters of a man who had abandoned his child. Robert, my father, wrote with the careful grammar of someone self-conscious about their education, in sentences that were plain and direct and carried, underneath their plainness, a desperation that felt entirely real. He asked about me by name in every letter. He described specific things he remembered, a red coat I'd apparently had, a habit I'd had of lining up objects in rows, a word I'd mispronounced that had made him laugh. Details a man invents don't carry that texture. Details a man remembers do. He wrote that he wanted to see me. He wrote that he didn't understand why Sylvia had stopped responding to his calls. He wrote, in the fourth letter, that he'd driven to Kellerton and Sylvia had met him at the door and told him I was fine and that his presence was disruptive and that she would call the police if he came again. He wrote that he'd consulted a lawyer about visitation rights and had been told that without a custody agreement, they'd never married, the process would be lengthy and expensive and the outcome uncertain, and that a court battle might harm me more than his absence. He wrote, in the seventh letter, I think about Dana every day. If she ever asks about me, please tell her I didn't leave. Tell her I tried. Sylvia had never told me. I sat with the letters in my lap and I tried to locate the correct emotional response to what I was reading and I couldn't find one. The feeling was too large and too structurally destabilizing for the normal vocabulary of feeling. It wasn't anger yet. It was something anterior to anger, the sensation of a load-bearing wall dissolving, and everything that had rested on it shifting, slowly, in the new absence of support. I didn't tell Paul that night. I put the letters back in the box and I put the box on the closet shelf and I went downstairs and I made tea and I sat at the kitchen table and when Paul asked if I was all right I said I was just tired from the drive. I didn't ask myself why I kept it from him. I know now, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. The information was already inside me. I needed time to decide what to do with it before it became a conversation, before it had to survive contact with someone else's reaction. I called Miriam the next morning. I didn't tell her about the letters. I asked, carefully, if she remembered my father. If she'd known him. The pause that followed was the longest pause Miriam had ever given me, and Miriam was a woman who filled silences quickly out of nervous habit. "Why are you asking?" she said. "I've been thinking about him," I said. "I've been thinking about him a lot lately." Another pause. "Then, you should talk to your mother." "I'm asking you." She was quiet for a moment that had a specific texture, the texture of someone deciding how much they owe a person they've been keeping a secret from for 40 years. Then she said, "He wasn't what she told you, Dana. He really wasn't." She wouldn't say more. She said it wasn't her place. She said I needed to talk to Sylvia. I understood two things from that call. The first was that Miriam had known. Not the full architecture, perhaps, but enough that she'd spent 40 years carrying the weight of knowing and choosing silence over truth. The second was that whatever Sylvia had built, she hadn't built it entirely alone. Miriam's silence had been a foundation stone. Something shifted in me then that I recognized as the end of a particular kind of innocence, not the dramatic kind, not the sudden kind, but the slow, irreversible kind that comes from understanding that the people who shaped you were doing it with more intention than you ever realized. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it wasn't straightforward and it wasn't entirely dignified and it mattered. I looked for him. It took me 4 days. Robert Vane was not a difficult man to find. He had a modest digital presence, a woodworking business with a simple website out of a town called Gracefield, 2 hours north of Kellerton. There were photographs on the site. A man in his late 60s, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, in a workshop surrounded by half-finished furniture. A wedding ring. A dog visible in one corner of one photo. I looked at those photographs for a long time. I was not looking for resemblance, or I was trying not to, but it found me anyway. Something in the set of his jaw, the particular way he held his head slightly to one side in one of the photos, was familiar in a way that lived below conscious recognition. The body knows things before the mind will admit them. I did not call him yet. I wasn't ready. What I did instead was go back to my own history with the letters as a new lens and start looking at everything I thought I'd understood. I pulled out the photograph albums from our storage closet. Sylvia had given me several when I first moved out, my childhood documented from age 3 onward. I went through them slowly, looking not at the images but at the gaps. There were no photographs before age 3. None. I had always known this and had accepted the explanation. They'd moved twice, things were lost, old film didn't always develop well. Looking at it now, the absence had a different quality. Not accident. Removal. I called a woman named Beverly, my mother's oldest friend, who had been present at the edges of my childhood and had moved to Phoenix 15 years ago. We weren't close but we were cordial. I framed the call as catching up, steered it gently toward the early years, toward my father. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother made a very specific decision when you were small." I disagreed with it. I told her so once and she never really forgave me for it. She paused. Robert tried. He tried very hard for a long time. "Your mother was," she stopped, choosing words. "Your mother was determined. When she made up her mind about something, that was it." "Why?" I said. "Why did she cut him out?" "He'd been seeing someone else briefly, before you were born, not during, before. She found out after. She never got past it. She decided he was the kind of man who couldn't be trusted and she decided you were better off without that uncertainty." Beverly's voice carried something between sadness and exhaustion. "She thought she was protecting you." I believe she genuinely thought that. But protecting someone and controlling what they're allowed to know are different things, and Sylvia was never very good at seeing the line between them. I sat with that for the rest of the day. There it was, not a monster, not a sociopath, not a woman who had destroyed her child's connection to a father out of cruelty. A woman who had been hurt and had made a decision from inside that hurt, and had then spent 40 years maintaining the decision because unmaintaining it would have required her to admit what maintaining it had cost me. Every year of silence made the silence harder to break. Every year made the truth more damaging and therefore more necessary to keep buried. I understood it. I didn't forgive it yet, but I understood the mechanism. What I understood simultaneously, and this landed with a particular weight, was that I had been doing something similar on a smaller scale my entire life. Every time I'd noticed something uncomfortable about my mother's story and chosen not to pull the thread. Every time I'd filed Miriam's careful stillness under anxious personality and moved on. I had been cooperating with the architecture of the lie without knowing the lie existed, but I had been cooperating. The not asking had been my contribution. That was the hardest thing to sit with. Not the betrayal itself, but my own participation in its maintenance. I thought about what I teach my students. About who benefits from a particular version of events. And I understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with blame and everything to do with honesty, that I had benefited from not knowing. Not knowing meant not having to grieve a father who had actually tried to stay. Not knowing meant the story was simple. Not knowing let me keep my mother intact. I called Robert Vane on a Thursday afternoon in April, sitting in my car in the school parking lot after the last bell, with the windows up and the engine off and the spring light flat and pale on the windshield. He answered on the second ring. His voice was careful when I said my name, not cold, not guarded, but careful in the specific way of someone who has waited a long time for something and doesn't trust that it's actually arrived. He said, "Dana." Just my name, the way you say something you've said privately to yourself many times but never out loud to the right person. We talked for 2 hours that first call. Not about Sylvia yet, about me, about him, about the ordinary geography of 2 lives that had run parallel without touching. He told me about Gracefield, about the woodworking business he'd started after he retired from construction, about his wife Carol who had known about me since their 3rd date and had, he said, spent years quietly hoping I would find him. He asked about my work, about my family, asked about Eli with a specific gentleness that meant something. I asked him, eventually, why he'd stopped writing. "The last letter came back unopened," he said. "Returned to sender, in your mother's handwriting." And I'd consulted a second lawyer by then, and she said, with a child that age, a prolonged legal battle does damage that can't be undone. She said if the mother is stable and the child is cared for, courts are reluctant. She said sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is wait and trust the child to find their own way to the truth eventually. His voice was level, but underneath the level surface there was something that had been held in careful containment for a long time. I want you to know I didn't believe that, exactly. But I didn't have a better answer. I believed him. Not blindly. I understood that I was hearing his version of events and that his version, like all versions, was shaped by what it needed to be. But the letters were real. Beverly was real. Miriam's 40-year silence was real. The absence of photographs before age 3 was real. The evidence didn't require me to believe he was perfect. It only required me to believe he had tried. And he had. He had tried for 5 years, in the only ways left available to him. I drove to Sylvia's house the following Sunday. She knew something was coming before I said a word. She had the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a knock they've expected for years. The kitchen smelled the same. The curtains were the same. She poured coffee without asking and sat across from me with her hands around her cup. I put 3 of the letters on the table between us. I didn't speak. She looked at them. She didn't touch them. Her face went through something, not quite the sequence I'd expected. Not defensiveness first, not explanation. Something quieter and older than either of those. Something that looked, from where I sat, like exhaustion. "How long have you had those?" she said. "You gave them to me," I said. "In that box." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." That single word rearranged several things I'd assumed. She had known the letters were in the box. She had given me the box. After 40 years of silence, my 77-year-old mother had packed the evidence of her own deception into a cardboard box and written my name on the top and left it on the kitchen table. "Why now?" I said. She looked at her coffee. "I'm 67, she said. "I've been thinking about what I leave behind." She paused. "I told myself for years that I did the right thing. That you were better off. That he wasn't reliable and you didn't need that uncertainty." Another pause, longer. "I still think some of that is true. But I've been thinking about the things that aren't." I sat across from my mother and I felt a complicated thing, not the rage I'd expected, not the tears I'd expected, but something more like grief for a version of my life that had never existed and now never could. A father who attended school plays. A father I'd called when I was 26 and newly married and taking stock. 40 years of an absence I'd been told was abandonment that was actually something else entirely. "He didn't leave," I said. "No," she said. "He didn't." The word cost her something. I watched it cost her. And I understood, without forgiving, without minimizing, but with the particular clarity that comes from being a person who thinks carefully about history, that Sylvia had lived inside her version of this story for so long it had become real to her. She had started with a wound and built a wall around it, and eventually the wall had become the architecture of our entire family. She hadn't been lying, exactly, for the last 20 years. She'd been maintaining something she could no longer see clearly enough to dismantle. "I've spoken to him," I said. She looked up. "We've talked twice. We're going to meet next month." She nodded once. Very slowly. She didn't say she was glad. She didn't say she was sorry, not then, not in the words I wanted. What she said, after a long silence, was, "Is he well?" It was such a strange question, and it carried in its strangeness the entire 40-year distance between what she'd done and what she'd felt about the person she'd done it to. She had erased him from my life. She had also, somewhere in the private interior that she'd never let me see, wondered about him for 40 years. I said yes. He was well. I met Robert in May. Gracefield is a small town with wide streets and the particular unhurried quality of a place that has never been in a hurry. His workshop was at the back of a property with a farmhouse at the front, white clapboard, a porch, flower beds that Carol had clearly tended with more commitment than the lawn. She met me at the door first, which I later understood had been planned. She wanted to make sure the first 30 seconds were manageable, that I had a neutral presence to land on before I saw him. He was standing in the living room when I came in. Tall, gray, wearing the slightly formal stillness of someone who has rehearsed for a moment so many times that the actual moment feels both familiar and entirely new. We stood looking at each other for a few seconds. Then he said, "You have your grandmother's eyes." "My mother's." His voice was steady but working to be. "I've wanted to tell you that for 40 years. I don't know how to describe what that felt like without making it sound smaller than it was or larger than it was. It felt like a correction. Like a sentence that had been left grammatically incomplete for 4 decades and had just received its missing clause. We spent 2 days in Gracefield. We talked for hours, about his life, about mine, about the specific textures of all the years between us. He showed me photographs, including ones from before I was 3, including ones that made the absence of those years in my own albums visible in a new way. Carol cooked and gave us space and joined us when the space had done its work. She had a warmth that wasn't performative and a humor that suggested she'd been good for him. On the second evening, sitting on the porch with the late spring light going golden over the fields, Robert said, "I don't want you to think that because I tried, I was perfect. I wasn't. I made mistakes before you were born that I understood too late. I'm not asking you to rewrite me as a hero." "I know," I said. "I'm just asking to be real to you," he said. "That's all I ever wanted. Just to be real." I thought about that on the drive home. To be real. To exist in someone's life as an actual person rather than an absence or a story. It was so simple and so fundamental, and my mother had spent 40 years denying him exactly that. Not out of cruelty, out of a wound she'd never properly closed, out of a decision she'd made from inside her worst pain and then built a life around because dismantling it would have cost more than she knew how to pay. I confronted Miriam separately. That conversation was harder and shorter. She had been 24 when it started, young, close to her sister, unwilling to damage a relationship that mattered to her by naming something her sister had asked her to leave alone. I understood the calculus. It didn't make 40 years of silence acceptable. We are still family. We are not what we were. Sylvia and I are still in contact. I drive to Denton less frequently now, not as punishment, but because I needed distance to process what had been rebuilt, and distance became necessary for its own reasons. She has not apologized in the specific words I used to want. She has, instead, started asking about Robert. Small questions, carefully placed. She asks if he's well. She asks about the woodworking. She asked once, carefully, if his wife was kind. It is the closest she can get, I think, to something that functions as acknowledgement. Paul has been steady through all of it, the best version of steady, the kind that doesn't require explanation. Eli has been curious in the way of teenagers, asking practical questions about Robert with the directness of someone not yet practiced at the emotional navigation this topic requires. I've been honest with him. He knows he has a grandfather in Gracefield who makes furniture and has a dog and wants to meet him when Eli is ready. Eli said he'd think about it. He's been thinking about it for 3 months. I suspect he'll be ready soon. I teach history. I have spent 17 years explaining that what we inherit, the stories, the silences, the carefully maintained versions of the past, shapes us in ways we can't fully see until we step outside the frame. I have said this in classrooms to teenagers who thought it was theoretical. It was never theoretical. I am 42 years old and I have a father. He is 69 and makes furniture and remembers a red coat I wore when I was 3. He exists. That's not a small thing. After 4 decades of a story that said otherwise, the fact of his existence, real, specific, present, is still something I have to remind myself is allowed to be true. The box is still in my closet. I kept the letters. Some things you don't put away again. What Sylvia built was not unusual in its origins. A young woman, hurt by someone she'd trusted, making a decision from inside that hurt to protect herself and her child. The decision made sense in the moment it was made. What transformed it from a wound into a 40-year architecture was the compounding, each year of silence making the truth harder to tell, each year adding another layer of consequence that made disclosure feel increasingly catastrophic. This is how long deceptions work. Not through constant active lying, but through the passive maintenance of a story that becomes, over time, indistinguishable from fact. Sylvia hadn't needed to lie to Dana about Robert on a regular basis because the foundation had been set so early and so completely that it required no reinforcement. The story was simply the weather, and Dana, like anyone raised inside a particular climate, had no reference point for what a different one might feel like. What the 11 letters expose is the specific cost of that maintenance. Robert had tried, consistently, painfully, for 5 years, and Sylvia's response to that effort had been to convert it into silence and then into the story of a man who hadn't tried at all. She hadn't invented a villain. She'd taken a man with real flaws, a brief infidelity before Dana's birth, genuine, and magnified those flaws into an entire identity, then used that constructed identity to justify every subsequent year of erasure. It was internally coherent. It was also a fundamental theft. The box on the kitchen table changes the moral geometry of the story in a way that resists simple interpretation. Sylvia put the letters in that box. She wrote Dana's name on the top. After 40 years, she handed her daughter the means of dismantling the story she'd built. This was not confession. She didn't call Dana to explain, didn't sit her down and speak plainly. It was closer to abdication, a woman at 67 deciding she was too tired to keep carrying the structure alone and leaving its collapse to be managed by the person it had been built around. Whether that constitutes courage or one final act of avoidance is a question the story deliberately refuses to answer. Miriam's position illuminates the way deception radiates outward from its source. She hadn't constructed the lie. She had simply chosen, year after year, to honor her sister's version of events over her niece's right to accurate information. The choice was understandable in its individual iterations. She was young, it wasn't her story, Sylvia was her sister. The cumulative effect of 40 years of those individual choices was complicity. Miriam's careful stillness whenever the subject arose, which Dana had noticed and misread for decades, was the visible surface of a 40-year calculation that never came out in Dana's favor. What Dana's story ultimately reveals is that the most damaging family secrets are rarely about dramatic crimes. They're about decisions made from pain, maintained through discipline, and passed on as truth to people who had no way to question them. The damage isn't only the loss of a relationship, it's the distortion of self-understanding that comes from building an identity on a story that wasn't accurate. Dana had shaped herself, in part, around the fact of being fatherless. That shaping had consequences, in what she expected from men, in why she'd chosen Paul's particular brand of steady presence, in the extra layer of gratitude she felt watching him father Eli. None of those consequences were erased by finding Robert. But they needed to be understood differently. Regrieved, in a sense, from the correct starting point. What I find most painful about this story, and I've sat with it for a while, is the red coat. Robert remembered a red coat Dana wore when she was 3. He wrote about it in a letter that was never answered. He carried that detail for 40 years. And Dana had no memory of the coat, no photograph, no trace of it, because the years that contained it had been carefully removed from her version of her own childhood. That's what hurts most to me. Not the large abstract loss of a relationship. The small, specific, irretrievable things. A red coat. A mispronounced word that made someone laugh. The ordinary texture of early childhood that belongs to every person as their own, and that was taken from Dana not in anger but in the name of protection. Sometimes protection and erasure wear the same face. The difference is whether the person doing the protecting is willing, eventually, to let the protected one decide for themselves. Dana decided. At 42, with a box on a kitchen table, she finally got to decide.